Welcome to This Explainer. Okay, picture this. You drop an absolute fortune just to secure a home. And then, a few years down the line, you're told to pack your bags and leave, with absolutely zero to show for that massive investment. Today, we're unpacking a really intense, high-stakes legal clash over in Maharashtra. It's all about the historic Pagdi tenancy system. We're going to rely directly on the advocacy materials from the Pagdi Ekta Song to really break down this complex debate over property rights, eviction laws, and fair compensation. Whether you're a total real estate law nerd or you're just wondering how these old-school tenancy systems clash with modern eviction suits, stick around. We're going to map out exactly what's at stake here.
Right off the bat, let's look at the central paradox the campaign brings up, because it's a big one. Think about it. You pay this hefty market value sum simply to get the right to occupy a space. Can a tenant who paid all that money to move in realistically be evicted for absolutely nothing? Well, that is the million-dollar question, sometimes quite literally, driving the initiative we're looking at today. So, to untangle this whole knot, we'll map things out across 5 key areas. First, we'll get a grip on understanding Pagdi tenancy. Then, we'll look at the core legal conflict, followed by an eviction reality check. After that, we'll explore tenancy as property rights, and wrap up with the quest for justice.
All right, diving right into Section 1, Understanding Pagdi Tenancy. We'll see why this is fundamentally way more than just paying rent.
The campaign makes a really strong point right out of the gate. A Pagdi tenant isn't just your average renter. They're a very specific legal entity. We're talking about a protected tenant under the Maharashtra Rent Control Act of 1999. Now, the magic word here is Pagdi. It's a lump sum premium, a capital investment. This is not just a standard security deposit that you get back when you move out, you know? It represents a legally recognized financial stake in the property, one that actually gives the tenant transferable and inheritable rights.
To put that into perspective, the initiative lays out a pretty clear comparison. Think of an ordinary tenant. They pay monthly rent, they have zero ownership stake, and it's purely a temporary setup. Because of that, they don't get the protections under Section 56 of the Act. But a protected Pagdi tenant, they've made that hefty capital investment, their rights can literally be passed down to their kids or transferred to someone else. It's almost like a hybrid ownership right, which puts them squarely under the protection of Section 56. The campaign's whole point is that these folks are recognized stakeholders. They aren't just crashing there for free.
Which brings us to Section 2, the core legal conflict. We're going to look at Section 16 up against Section 56.
Okay, so here is where the primary friction really sparks. It's a showdown between two parts of the Maharashtra Rent Control Act. In one corner, you've got Section 16. This gives the landlord the power to seek recovery of the property, usually by claiming a bona fide need, basically saying they genuinely need it for themselves or their family. But in the other corner is Section 56. This section explicitly recognizes and protects the Pagdi tenant's economic investment. It legally allows them to claim and receive consideration, which is just a legal way of saying payment, if they relinquish their tenancy.
Now, the Pagdi Ekta Song's argument really centers on balance. They argue that you can't just weaponize Section 16 and act like Section 56 doesn't exist. They see these two sections as two sides of the same coin. They have to be read together. Sure, a landlord has the right to get their property back, but the campaign insists the law also demands fairness. That recovery can happen, but only if the tenant's paid rights are respected and they get just compensation. If a court only applies Section 16, the campaign argues it creates a legally contradictory free eviction that totally wipes out the tenant's paid investment.
All right, moving into Section 3, the eviction reality check. We're going to follow the money here. Let's look at the sheer scale of the money involved. 50 lakhs. That's a massive, massive figure. And the campaign uses it to show the heavy, upfront, market value cost a Pagdi tenant often has to scrape together just to acquire these legal possession rights. Think about the reality of that for a family. This isn't charity. It's not a quick, temporary stay. They literally bought their way in.
And when you break down that 50 lakhs, it reveals a pretty critical detail about how this whole system works. When a new tenant comes in, that money gets split. Based on the source's example, 35 lakhs might go to the outgoing tenant who is leaving the space, but a very hefty 15 lakhs, that goes straight into the landlord's pocket as transfer charges. The campaign uses this breakdown to hammer home a vital fact. Getting into a Pagdi property is never, ever free, and the landlord is directly profiting from the transaction. So, this brings us to a really serious question posed by the initiative. Imagine a landlord happily accepts that 15 lakhs transfer charge. But then, a few years later, they turn around and file an eviction suit, claiming they have a bona fide requirement to take the space back without paying anything in return. If that happens, what exactly did the tenant pay for in the first place?
The advocacy group flags this as a huge contradiction. They see it as an economic injustice, where the landlord basically double dips, while the tenant faces forced, uncompensated dispossession.
This financial reality leads us straight into Section 4, Tenancy as Property Rights. Let's look at the rules of relinquishment.
According to the campaign, there are basically 3 ways a tenant might give up possession of a property. 1, by consent, so a voluntary agreement. 2, by compulsion, meaning under some kind of outside pressure. Or 3, by a formal court order directing an eviction. But their core argument here is super simple. The way the relinquishment happens, it absolutely doesn't matter. The underlying rights stay exactly the same. So, the absolute deal breaker for them is this. Fair and just compensation, specifically at current market value, is a strict statutory right, period. It doesn't matter if the landlord genuinely needs the property for redevelopment or personal use. Those reasons for eviction don't just magically erase the tenant's right to be paid. In their reading of the law, if no compensation is offered, then no valid relinquishment of the tenancy has actually happened.
And there's a really fascinating legal principle the campaign brings up next. They argue that tenant rights actually survive an eviction. Think about that for a second. Even if a court passes a decree and physically removes a tenant from the property, their statutory right to claim the monetary value of that tenancy continues. They maintain what's called a continuing cause of action. So an eviction might take away the physical keys, but according to this specific reading of the law, the financial rights simply cannot be snuffed out without compensation. To do otherwise, the group argues, is basically allowing the unjust enrichment of the landlord.
And that takes us to our final part. Section 5, the quest for justice. We're going to look at the demands and the big questions being asked. No free possession, no free eviction. That is the definitive rallying cry for the Pagdi Ekta Sung. It perfectly boils down their absolute zero-tolerance stance against uncompensated dispossession. They're demanding that the courts officially recognize the value of a Pagdi tenancy, put a stop to these free evictions, and legally mandate fair, market-linked compensation before a landlord gets their hands back on the property.
To really push this agenda forward, they've laid out 5 major questions for justice, and these are aimed straight at the legal system itself. They're basically urging judges to look past surface-level arguments. They're asking, should courts really allow landlords to make these massive windfall gains through dishonest practices? And if an eviction order is based on exaggerated claims, doesn't that make the court an unwitting party to injustice? They're advocating for these kinds of suits to be totally dismissed to protect the dignity of the law, insisting that Sections 16 and 56 have to be applied together, so the legal process isn't abused. I'm going to leave you with one final, provocative thought straight from the source material, because it really perfectly sums up the entire paradox. If entry into a Pagdi tenancy legally and practically requires a huge market value payment, how on earth can an exit be forced by the state without any compensation at all? It's a tough question, and it really forces us to think deeply about this highly contentious balance between a landlord's property rights and a tenant's hard-earned financial investments. Thanks for joining me for this explainer. Keep asking those big questions, and I'll catch you next time.